Chapter 7 of Zhang Henshui's Cause of Laughter. It's worth forgetting your worries and the song in the sky. It's a pity that the person in the painting is an outsider. Jia Shu asked Shu Gu why she suddenly started to learn Buddhism and enlightenment. Shu Gu found it difficult to answer this point even for a moment. While I was hesitating, I happened to be peeling off the fish again in the ancient temple next door, making the sound of a wooden fish. Yin pointed to the outside of the wall and said with a smile, "Listen to the sound of the wooden fish next door. Isn't that enough to arouse people's thoughts of learning Buddhism?" Jia Shu felt that her words were a bit forced. "But that's just what people said. You can't say she's lying." Yin smiled and said, "As expected, young lady, you are really a sensible person." After saying that, he smiled slightly. Looking at his expression, Shu Gu seemed a little disbelieving, so she smiled and said, "It's hard to explain people's thoughts." After saying this, she lowered her head and turned to the scriptures again. Jia Shu didn't speak for a while, and Shu Gu didn't look up for a while. Jia Shu coughed twice, took out his handkerchief and wiped his face, and asked, "When uncle comes back, maybe it will be over?" He looked at the sky outside the curtain and sat for a while, then said, "Since uncle doesn't know when he will come back, I don't have to wait here. When he comes back, please tell me that if he has the skills, ask him to call me and we will make an appointment to talk in the future." "Mr. Fan, won't you sit down for a while?" Jia Shu thought for a while, then saw Shu Gu still sitting there with his head down. "I won't sit down anymore. Let's talk some more when uncle is at home one day." After saying that, he stood up and opened the curtain and came out. Shu Gu only lifted the curtain and stretched out half of her body, and then stopped, sending it away. Jia Shu also felt very frustrated, so she couldn't blame her for her gentle reception. After walking out of her door and reaching the middle of the alley, she looked back and saw Shu Gu standing by the door, holding onto the door frame and looking blankly this way. When Jia Shu looked back, she shrank back and disappeared. Jia Shu stood in the alley and was stunned for a moment. He turned around, walked a few steps, and stopped again. There was a rickshaw parked at the entrance of the alley. He asked, "Do you want a car?" Jia Shu was shocked and took the car to Daxi Hutong. As soon as Jia Shu arrived at Daxi Alley, Feng Shi came from the house to the yard and said with a smile, "I came back from get out of class early and I am always waiting for you at home. I want to go out and have fun. Why did you come just now?" When she said that, she took Jia Shu's hand and pulled him into the house. Jia Shu said, "No, I am a little worried today, and am too lazy to go out to play." She pulled him into the house, led him to the table in front of the window, and pressed. He sat down in front of the mirror, took a comb, and was about to comb Jia Shu's head. Jia Shu could see clearly in the mirror, and quickly stopped him with his hands, saying with a smile, "Stop it, stop it. Now, if you comb it even more, it will look like a woman's hair." Feng Shi said, "If you don't comb it, it doesn't matter if you just leave it unkempt. If you comb it and have a bunch of hair messed up, it's shabby." Jia Shu smiled and said, "If you say that, I'll let it get messy tomorrow. I think it's much easier to do it that way." While speaking, he raised his left hand to support his head on the table. Feng Shi looked into the mirror and smiled. "What's wrong? Look at this man. His eyebrows are almost furrowed together. What's so unpleasant about you today? Can you tell me?" Jia Shu said, "It's true that I feel a little unhappy, but this matter has nothing to do with me." Feng Shi said, "What are you talking about? Since it is irrelevant, why are you unhappy about it?" Jia Shu said, "Now that I've said it, you have to break the monster too. The eldest girl from the Guan family who came to our place last time has suddenly started chanting sutras and practicing Buddhism. It seems that she wants to become a monk. A very good person. Wouldn't it be ruined by this?" Feng Shi said, "Then what is she doing? Is there any trouble at home? No wonder she looked sad when she came to our house last time. But this won't hinder you. Why are you crying while listening to ancient books and worrying about the ancients?" Jia Shu smiled and said, "I said the same thing myself, but I always feel uneasy because of this matter. Do you think it's strange?" Feng Shi said, "What's so strange about that? I see that your relationship is pretty good." Jia Shu said, "Her father and I are friends, so it would be nice to have something to do with her." Feng Shi looked into the mirror and said, "Do you know that he is a very good man?" Jia Shu also smiled at the mirror. Feng Shi combed Jia Shu's hair smooth, and said with a smile, "I want you to take me out to play. Since you are unhappy, I won't say anything." Jia Shu said, "It's not that I'm unhappy. I am always afraid of meeting someone. You have to wait half a year for me to inform your family about this. I will accompany you wherever you fall in love. In the past 2 days, they were spying on my actions, so I just pretended not to know and went out as usual. When I went out, I either went to some university to find friends, or I went to places where they usually go. When I went home, I went around again. I hired a car to go back and asked the servant to pay for the car. They have been investigating me for 2 weeks and have not found out my whereabouts. They are probably a little confused. Feng Shi said, they are relatives. You spend your money. Can they control it? They can't control it, but they can't help but send a letter to my home. If my family knew about this before I even informed them, wouldn't that be a trouble? At least our support can be cut off. Where can I find money to spend? Before Feng Shi could answer, Aunt Shen answered in the room outside, saying, that's right. This matter must be discussed slowly. Now, as long as you study well, let me rejoice. Your life's big thing is made of iron. Jia Shu smiled and said, you don't quite believe me, do you? According to what you said, shouldn't she study? Well, will you change your mind? Aunt Shen didn't agree to anything, so she followed and winked at Jia Shu and smiled again. Feng Shi smiled at Jia Shu and said, fool, mom is scaring me because she's afraid I won't work hard. If you follow her words again, you will see how scared I will be. Jia Shu heard what she said and stood up. He sat with 2 feet, but the foot underneath was clapping continuously. He folded his hands in front of his chest and just looked at his big half-length photo with a smile. Feng Shi patted his shoulder and said with a smile, look at you like this, you can't be petty. Look at the way you look at yourself. Jia Shu smiled and said, guess, what am I thinking about now? Out. What you mean is that this guy is good looking, and he needs to find a nice girl to match him. Yes or no? Jia Shu smiled and said, you guessed it, but you only guessed half of it. What I mean is that he has found a good girl, but I don't know if this good girl can always trust him. Feng Shi's face sank, and she said, are you telling the truth, or are you just joking? Could it be that you still don't trust me until now? Jia Shu smiled and said, don't worry. It makes sense. Feng Shi said, then if you say this, I have to dig out my heart and show it to you. Don't tell me, it's my mother and my uncle. One day they won't miss you. A few times. If you want to say that they are half-hearted, you will have to ask them to give you a sign of longevity. Jia Shu saw that her face was red, her cheeks were slightly bulging, and her eyelids were drooping, which made her look darker and darker. Long eyelashes. This kind of delicate and slightly angry look is also a kind of beauty that cannot be described. Yin shook her hand and said, this is a joke of mine. Why are you taking it seriously? Feng Shi, however, lowered his head and remained silent. By this time, Aunt Shen had already left long ago. As soon as Jia Shu and Feng Shi joked, she would avoid them. Seeing that Feng Shi was still angry, Jia Shu let go of her hand and was about to lower the door curtain. Feng Shi smiled and took his hand and said, what are you doing? The door curtain is hanging. What's in your way? Jia Shu smiled and said, put it down for you, okay? Feng Shi simply put the one down. She also took his hand, stared slightly, and said, you are talking nicely, but you are making trouble again. Jia Shu said, wouldn't you be angry that you are still alive? Feng Shi thought for a while. He smiled and said, I'm not angry anymore, so you can stop making trouble, okay? Jia Shu smiled and said, okay. Then you have to bring the yuekin and sing a piece for me. Feng Shi said, sing a piece, that's fine, but you have to behave yourself. Just play the piano under the moon like last time. When you feel happy, you do whatever you want. Jia Shu said with a smile, that's not a fool. I'll let you play a good part. When Feng Shi heard that, he washed his hands, he took down the yuekin hanging on the wall, sat facing the family tree, and played a part of Love in Four Seasons. Jia Shu asked, why do you only play and not sing? Feng Shi smiled and said, I don't quite understand the lyrics. I don't want to sing. Jia Shu said, since you don't want to sing, why don't you sing? Why are you playing this again? Feng Shi said, I heard you say that this tune is so good that it can only be found in the sky and cannot be found in the earth. So I asked my uncle to teach me. My uncle said it was an unfashionable tune. He hadn't played it for many years, and he had forgotten it. He thought about it for 2 days and asked someone before he copied the lyrics. I learned it from my uncle yesterday. I just learned it. If you like this, how do you think I can play it? Is it as good as what you heard before? Jia Shu said with a smile. I used to listen to singing, not playing. If you want me to say it, I will do it. Can't tell a reason why. Feng Shi smiled and said, well, you just want me to sing a verse. Well, listen. So she turned sideways, tuned the string, turned around and smiled at Jiashu, and then started to play and sing. Jiashu smiled at her, and even the sound of snoring was almost gone. Feng Shi was allowed to finish playing and singing, nodded repeatedly and said, you are so smart. Not only can you sing well, but you are also considerate. He leaned against the wall, stretched himself, smiled at Jiashu, and said, how is it? Jiashu also looked at her and smiled, and remained silent for a long time. Feng Shi said, why don't you speak? Jiashu said, I can play this tune well. One day, I brought my cave flute. You will sing and I will play. See if we can get along. Can't match it? When I heard you singing just now, I remembered that the lyrics you sang before were not as good as yours. I don't know why. So I got lost. Feng Shi smiled and said, well, you are so naughty. You make me angry at one moment and make me laugh at the other. I really admire your ability. Jiashu saw her behavior. Nothing is unlovable, and the boredom I felt just now at Guan's house has been completely eliminated. Jiashu was at Shen's house that day and talked about going back after dinner. After arriving home, I saw that the lights were on in the upper room. I guessed that the uncle and his wife were at home. He didn't take off his hat, so he walked all the way to the upper room. Bohi held an evening newspaper in his hand, half a cigar in his mouth, and lay on the sofa to read. Seeing Jiashu entering the door, he put the newspaper down, smiled, and raised the newspaper with both hands to cover his face. Jiashu only saw bursts of thick smoke, rising straight from the newspapers. The newspaper he held in his hand was shaking constantly, as if his whole body was shaking with laughter. Jiashu lowered his head and looked at himself. There was a bright red flower stuck in his collar hole. He quickly took the flower off and held it in his hand. Just at this time, Mrs. Tao opened the door curtain and came out smiling. Don't hide it, I have already seen it. Jiashu had no choice but to throw the flowers into the spittoon, and said with a smile, the more guilty I am, the more guilty I am. It will solve the case. What's the point? Mrs. Tao said with a smile. No one cares about that kind of thing, and wants to solve your case. What I don't understand is that we are serious about introducing it to you, but you don't care and ignore it. But behind our backs, how could you to be so good? Jiashu smiled and said, I don't quite understand what my cousin said. Who did you introduce to me? Mrs. Tao smiled and said, hey, you are still pretending to be stupid. How did I introduce Miss He to you? You are always in trouble, and don't bother to be friends with her. It turns out that you are very close to her in private. Only then did she realize that she was talking about Helena, and he felt relieved. Yin smiled and said, cousin, do you have any evidence for what you said? Mrs. Tao said, yes, but it's about to be taken out. How do you reply? Jiashu smiled and said, I've taken it out. I'll accompany you. No. Bohi hid his face in the newspaper, and said with a smile, you haven't offended us, so why do you want to accompany us? Jiashu said, then, let's be Jiaodong. Mrs. Tao said, that's true. But you can't do it alone. You are both invited, and we are here together. Jiashu smiled and said, no matter what the conditions are, I will accept them. Anyway, I am confident that you will not be able to produce any evidence from me. At that moment, Mrs. Tao remained silent, but took out a photo in her arms and stretched it out in front of the family tree. Jiashu smiled and said, who is this? When Jiashu looked at it, it was a new photo taken by Feng Shi. This photo was taken on the day Feng Shi had her haircut. It was said to be a souvenir for Jiashu. This photo is even more similar to Helena's. Yin smiled and said, this is not Miss He. Mrs. Tao said, who is Miss He? Tell me, am I such a good friend with her, and I can't even recognize her face? Jiashu just laughed. He said it wasn't Miss He, but he couldn't tell who this person was. Mrs. Tao smiled and said, in this way, we have wronged someone. I used to think that the girl you were interested in was the girl from the Guan family. I think that is not very convenient. We all live in the same alley. Of course, the rich and the poor are. It didn't matter. It was just that the old man Guan, Liu Fu, also recognized him and said that he was practicing tricks on the bridge, but it was not good for others to find out. Later, they moved away, and we were still suspicious. Until now, this mystery has been solved. Joshua said, I have complained to them a long time ago. I suspected that they moved too badly. Bohee put down the newspaper, sat up, and said with a smile, don't doubt that it was us. He left. But I asked Liu Fu to inquire about it twice, but the old man ran away together. Let's not talk about it anymore. Let's talk about the family tree. Tell the truth? Joshua was really embarrassed at this time. How can we rely on Miss He? If it is said that it belongs to Feng Shi, I am afraid that the trouble will be even greater if this is revealed. After pondering for a while, he said with a smile, you have real evidence, so I can't rely on you. In fact, miss, he didn't give it to me. I saw it in the photo studio and paid for it. I can't do this. Very generous. Please don't tell Miss He, otherwise I will offend a friend. Before Bohee and his wife agreed, Liu Fu came in and said, Miss, he is here. Jia Shu heard this. These words can't help but be startled. At this moment, I heard the clatter of leather shoes on the stone steps, and then someone laughed and said, here are the dinner guests. The curtain opened, and Helena came in. Today she only wore a narrow bud yellow silk shirt. Her forehead was tied with a string of beads, a Spanish hard-shell fan flower was inserted sideways, and she wore a large Spanish red flower shawl. There are long tassels hanging all around, which is really flat. As soon as she entered the door, she bowed to everyone and said with a smile, everyone is here. You must have just had dinner. I didn't catch up. As she spoke, she stood on a sofa with her back and held a hand in front of her chest. As soon as the hand on the corner of the shawl loosened, the scarf slipped down behind him and was piled together on the sofa. It turned out that Joshua was sitting near the sofa, and at this moment, he could only smell the fragrance of powder. At this moment, he could not help but look at Helena from head to toe. When his eyes flashed like this, Bohee's eyes also flashed with him. Helena seemed to have sensed something, so she said to Mrs. Tao, this dress is not new, and I haven't worn it for half a year. Do you think it fits me well? Mrs. Tao looked at her from head to toe again, smiled, nodded, and said, I can't tell that it is old. To take pictures with this kind of clothes, you have to stand in front of a black curtain, don't you think? Asking this, she couldn't help but look at Joshua. Joshua's whole body was hot, and he kept wanting to show it to his face. He took the evening newspaper from Bohee's hand and lay on the sofa to read it. Helena said, except for group photos, I haven't taken photos for a long time. Mrs. Tao paused, then smiled, and said, Miss He, come to my room, I'll show you something, and went to the house with Miss He. When they got to the house, they held hands and squeezed into a chair. Mrs. Tao smiled and said, don't worry, I'll show you something. Then she leaned her head on Helena's shoulder, took out the photo, held it in her palm to show her, and asked, guess where I got this photo from? She was wondering why the three of them treated me like this. Could it be because of this photo? This reminded her of the photo she saw in Joshua's book folder last time, and she understood most of it. Yin smiled and said, I know where you got it. Mrs. Tao stretched out an arm and hugged her waist, feeling even more intimate. She smiled and said, dear, can you give me one like this? After taking a look, she smiled and said, I know where you got this photo from, but Mrs. Tao said, there's no need to add any reservations like a diplomat. It's enough for you to know. But he said he bought it from a photo studio. I think this is wrong. If he is telling the truth, what is his intention to buy his girlfriend's photo privately? If he is lying, you gave him a precious thing, but he still doesn't appreciate it, which is even worse. Helena smiled and said, my wife, although you are very good at talking, I have nothing to say, and you can't get him to tell me. I really don't understand the matter of this photo. If you really want to ask clearly, it's better for you to ask Mr. Fan himself. If he is willing to tell the truth, you will know how. It has nothing to do with me. Mrs. Tao originally guessed that he might have to admit it, or pretend not to know. Now she said that she knew, but it had nothing to do with her. Her indifferent look really showed that there was something else going on. Although he was a very open-minded person, when it came to love, everyone would inevitably have something to hide. Then she smiled and said, oh, a photo is a very simple matter. Is there any other twists and turns? Then I won't say anything. Mrs. Tao just laughed it off, not wanting to make Miss He too embarrassed. Helena stood up, smiled at Mrs. Tao again, and said loudly, maybe you will understand in a few days. After saying that, Helena walked out of the room. Joshua leaned forward and smiled reluctantly, as if he was embarrassed, and said, Miss To-fan, you have also changed your suit. Joshua knew that she had nothing to say and just found a question to discuss, so it didn't matter if he didn't answer. But he didn't answer, because he felt he had nothing to say. He smiled and said, every time you wanted to go dancing, wasn't it because you didn't have a suit? I made a suit specially for dancing. Helena smiled and said, great. I'm here to invite Mr. and Mrs. Tao to dance. Then Miss To-fan can go with us. Joshua said, no, I only have casual clothes, and you all have to go to the Beijing hotel. I made an evening gown temporarily, but it's a bit too late. Helena said, although there are some rules to follow for dancing, it's not certain. Joshua shook his head and smiled. Why do you have to break the rules when you know it's against the rules? Helena then turned to Mrs. Tao and said, I haven't been to the 3-star hotel for a long time. Let's go to the 3-star hotel tonight. Is it okay to go to the store? Mrs. Tao heard this and looked at Bohee, who was holding a cigar in his mouth and holding his hands together. She then looked at Joshua, but Joshua turned his head and looked at the wall clock and said, it's only 9 o'clock. It's not time to dance yet, is it? Bohee then said to his wife, what do you think of Missy? Going to Sang Sing is also good, and it can also give my cousin some convenience. Joshua was about to continue, but Mrs. Tao smiled and said, if you continue, you will not only be sorry to Missy, but also to us. Joshua thought that Missy was very polite to him, and it would not be good for him to always not give her a little face, so he smiled and said, although I can't dance, it's okay to accompany her to watch. So everyone chatted for a while. When they went out of the gate, 2 cars stopped at the foot of the stone steps. Bohee and his wife got into their car first and drove away. Joshua and Helena were the only ones left on the stone steps. Before Joshua could say anything, Helena said, Miss To-fan, I have a broken car. Please bear with me and take my broken car. Joshua could not refuse, because she had made it clear, so he got into the car with her. In the car, Joshua leaned sideways against the corner of the car, and there was a foot of empty space between him and Helena on the middle seat cushion. Helena smiled at first, then looked at Joshua and said with a smile, I have a question to ask Miss To-fan. Last time I went to Baozhai, I saw a photo of a girl with long hair, who looked a lot like me. Today, Mrs. Tao showed me a photo of a girl with her hair cut, who looked even more like me. Mrs. Tao didn't ask any questions and just pointed out that the photo was of me. Joshua smiled and said, this is really unfair to Missy. Helena said, why is it unfair to me? Don't I allow your friend to be the same as me? Joshua smiled and said, because, I just thought it was a funny scene, but the misunderstanding was interesting. But I wonder if these 2 girls are sisters? Joshua said, it turns out to be the same person, but one photo was taken before her hair was cut, and the other was taken after her hair was cut. Helena said, which school is she in now? She is much younger than me. Joshua smiled. Helena said, you have such a beautiful girlfriend. Why don't you introduce her to us? I have never seen such a beautiful girl. Joshua smiled and said, she looks a bit like Missy. Helena paused twice on the car mat and smiled. You see, I was just being polite, and forgot that she and I have some similarities. Fortunately, this is only said in front of Miss Fan, and she knows that I am praising your friend. If I say it to others, wouldn't it be self-praise? When Joshua was about to say something else, the car had stopped at the entrance of the Samsung Hotel. The 2 of them put this aside and went into the ballroom together. At this time, Bohee and his wife had ordered drinks and were waiting in a very popular seat. When they came in, Bohee and his wife gave up their seats, and their brows became more and more cheerful. Helena pretended not to know, and continued to talk to Joshua as usual. Joshua was restrained and only agreed to one sentence when others mentioned it. Soon, the music started, and Bohee and Helena went to dance together. Joshua didn't know how to dance, and Mrs. Tao didn't have a partner, so the 2 of them just sat there drinking lemonade. Mrs. Tao looked at Missy, who was dancing, and said to Joshua, look, are there any women in this dance floor more beautiful than her? Joshua said, Missy is indeed beautiful, but I dare not say that she is better than anyone else. Mrs. Tao said, in the eyes of the beholder, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Just tell me, do you think she is more beautiful than anyone else? Joshua smiled and said, I dare not accept the word lover. About the photo, you may understand it in a few days. Mrs. Tao smiled and said, "Okay, you have already discussed the confession in the car and kept it a secret from us. If you need us in the future, can you do this? I have no other way to retaliate against you. Whatever I want to do in the future, I will keep it a secret from you. At that time, you must understand. I won't let you understand." Joshu just drank water and said nothing. After dancing, Bohee and Helena returned to their seats together. Seeing Mrs. Tao smiling, Helena asked, "Has Mrs. Tao asked Mr. Fan about the photo?" Joshu didn't expect her to ask this question directly. He put one hand on his forehead and pursed his lower lip, waiting for them to announce the content of the matter. Mrs. Tao said, "I still don't understand. He said I would understand in a few days." Helena said, "Let me tell you the truth. I only understood this matter for an hour. 2 hours ago. I didn't understand it like Mrs. Tao." Joshua was really anxious and couldn't help but knock her legs gently under the table with his right hand. Bohee said, "This is unreliable. This is what you two agreed on when you were in the car just now." Helena smiled and said, "Just tell the truth. I got a new photo and gave it to him. As for why?" Bohee and his wife smiled and said, "As long as you say this, it's fine. As for why, there's no need to say. We all understand." Miss He saw that they were getting more and more misunderstood, so she had to stop talking. At this time, the band started playing again. Bohee went to dance with his wife because she couldn't find a partner. Helena smiled and said to Joshu, "Why don't you let me tell the truth?" Joshu said, "Of course there is a reason, but I must let Miss He understand." Helena smiled and said, "Do you think I don't understand now?" As she said that, she broke off a small flower from the flower branch on the table, picked up the long flower stalk with 2 fingers, put it to the tip of her nose, and sniffed it. She lowered her eyes slightly, and there were 2 small dimples flashing on her cheeks like fancy. Joshua laughed for no reason, and Lena, laughed even harder. She took out a flowered silk handkerchief with her left hand, held her face, and leaned on the table. Mrs. Tao saw that the 2 of them were laughing like that, so she stopped dancing and went back to her seat with Bohee. Joshua said, "Why did you give up dancing halfway?" Mrs. Tao said, "I saw that you 2 were talking so interestingly, so I came to see what you were talking about. So funny." Helena just smiled at Bohee and his wife, unable to explain why. Joshua did the same, not saying a word. Bohee and his wife both agreed in their hearts and smiled at each other. Joshua didn't know how to dance, and after sitting for a long time, he didn't feel interesting at all, so he said to Bohee, "What should I do? I have to leave first." Mrs. Tao said, "It's getting late. Are you going to hire a rickshaw to go back?" Helena said, "It's already 2 o'clock. I can go too. I'll take the rickshaw back to Miss Tofan." After she said this, she stood up and said goodbye to Bohee. Joshua could no longer say that he would not go back. They all went to the storage room to get their clothes and hats, and went out the door together and got on the car together. At this time, all the residents on the street had returned home. The straight roads were quiet, and there was no sound at all. The cars were speeding on the street, and the street lights were like a shift, one by one, leaping behind the cars. Occasionally, there was a car from the opposite side, shining its lights from a distance, and the horn honked a few times and passed by. Apart from that, nothing could be seen on the street. The car turned across the street and went into the alley, and there was no trace or sound. Joshua said to Helena, "Our car will disturb many people's good dreams when it passes through the alley. The drunk people on the dance floor are almost the same as those who smoke opium. When others are sleeping soundly, they are in high spirits, eating and drinking. When they are done and go home and go to bed, then others should go to school and work." Helena just listened to his criticism without refutation. When the car arrived at the gate of Tao's house, Joshua got off the car and said a polite word, "See you tomorrow." Helena smiled and nodded and agreed, "See you tomorrow." Joshua had never slept so late before, so he went to sleep as soon as he returned to the room. Bohee and his wife did not go home until 4 o'clock in the morning. The next morning, Joshua woke up. It was almost 12 o'clock, and he waited for more than an hour before Bohee and his wife got up. After breakfast, he walked into the yard and saw the golden sunlight on the white wall in the east, reflecting most of the flower shadows. It can be imagined that the sun was setting in the west. He wanted to go out to see Fanxi, because yesterday's flaws were too obvious, so he read a few pages of books in the house first. Waited until Bohee went to the government office and Mrs. Tao went to the park. She thought they would not guess that she would go out, so she took her hat in her hand, put it on her back, and walked out slowly, as if she was taking a walk. When she walked into the alley, she looked up at the sky and saw a few scattered birds flying away with the sunset in the sky. She looked at the light pole again and saw that the light was on. Joshu hired a rickshaw and went straight to Daxi Hutong. When he saw Fangxi, he said, "You are really late today, but it is still morning for me." Fangxi said, "You slept very late. Did you just get up? What did you do yesterday?" Joshu said, "My cousin and his wife took me to dance. I don't know how to dance, so I stayed up all night in the restaurant for nothing." Fangxi said, "I heard that in the dance place, you can hug the girls and dance at will. Being a man, you really take advantage. You said you can't dance. I don't believe it. When you see people hugging a woman, don't you feel greedy?" Joshu smiled and said, "You may not believe what I said, but I think the communication between men and women should be secretive, so that it is more interesting." On the dance floor, in front of many people, even in front of someone's husband, hugging that woman, what evil thoughts can there be? Fangxi said, "You are so generous. Can you take me to have a look one day?" Joshu said, "I can go, but I'm always afraid of meeting acquaintances." When Fangxi heard this, she sat down on a rattan chair, crossed her fingers, placed them on her chest, lowered her head, and pouted. Joshu smiled and put his hand to touch her face. She started to say, "Don't tease me. You always act like a thief like this. You can't go anywhere. When will you be successful? You are not afraid of people when dancing with other girls, but you are afraid of people when going out with me." Joshu was really speechless after being teased by her, so he smiled and said, "This is not worth making such a big movie. I will accompany you once. You will be back very late." Fangxi said, "I don't have to go to the dance. I just don't like you always hiding like this. I feel uneasy, and even my whole family feels uneasy. Because you don't want to say it, I won't let my mother tell everyone. But if relatives and friends suddenly see it, our family will become a different place, and they may guess what bad things I have done." Joshu said, "For this matter, I have told you many times. Let's wait for a year or two. Everyone has their own difficulties. You must forgive me." Fangxi simply fell on the bed and fell asleep without saying a word. Joshu tried to explain, but it was useless. He got anxious and picked up a teacup and smashed it to the ground with a bang. Fangxi was really surprised by his behavior and grabbed his hand, asking, "What's wrong?" She almost cried. To know how, Joshu answered, "I will tell you next time." Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.